Hi, I'm Ben Neill, and I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the making of Fathom, Hudson River Data as Music, which is my contribution to the ICAD 2021 concert. First, some background on the piece. It grew out of a conversation I had with John Cronin, who's a longtime Hudson River environmental activist. I live in Beacon, New York, in the Hudson Valley, and Cronin was well known for being the founder of the River Keeper, a seminal environmental organization in this area. He also founded the Beacon Institute for Rivers and Estuaries, which is associated with Clarkson University. In my conversation with Cronin back in 2015, he described the REON project, which is a real-time monitoring network for rivers and estuaries. BIRE had several different data collection stations up and down the river. Fathom uses data from 7 monitoring sites along the Hudson River. Many different environmental factors were being monitored: barometric pressure, precipitation, humidity, temperature, wind direction, wind speed, and more. This idea interested me because of my work with numerical systems, aesthetics of non-intentionality and interactivity, and creating forms that replicate living systems. These have all been themes of my work over the last several decades, and so this project felt like a natural outgrowth of a vocabulary that I was already working with. The form of Fathom is divided into 3 sections based on data collected 2 weeks before, during, and 2 weeks after Hurricane Sandy, which was a dramatic environmental event with major impact on the Hudson River. And BIRE was interested in having a focus on Hurricane Sandy because of this impact, and that it was an example of how climate change and human intervention can create cataclysmic events. So BIRE's concern was to use artistic expression as a way of informing and educating the public about what was happening with global warming and climate change. Fathom is highly collaborative. It's co-created with vocalist songwriter Mimi Goese, who I've been collaborating with since 2006. I asked Mimi to join soon after I had gotten the idea to do the piece. The lyrics reflect the environmental themes of the work and add an emotional dimension. BIRE was extremely helpful, all of the data and information that we needed, as well as applying for a commission grant which we received from New Music USA. Crowdsourced video was collected from Hudson Valley residents. We put out a call for this and we got great support from the community and local press. So that video is all incorporated into the project. Live percussion was performed by Dean Sharp, and video and audio production assistance from Jimmy Warren and Carl Van Brunt. As I mentioned, 7 sites were used for the structure of Fathom, and different data was being collected in these different sites. The form of the piece is defined by the locations and their measurements, starting at West Point, moving up the river to North Creek, and then back down to West Point. There's a progression in the work from single direct translations of the environmental data to layering, more manipulations, repetition, and interpretation. And this creates a metaphor for the increasing human encroachment on the river over time. Here's the score for the work, which you can see begins with West Point, Beacon, Newburgh, Dutch Apple, Stillwater, Freeman's Bridge, and North Creek. Then we get to the storm section, and then we come back down the river in reverse order. And each one of these little windows is the graph for that 2-week period in which we are monitoring and translating the data. The creative process used in Fathom was quite complex and involved many steps. First, we took the REON graphs, reversed those in Photoshop so that they would be readable by the software synthesizer Metasynth. This is an older program, but it has a unique feature in which images can be interpreted sonically. Then the graphs were animated in Adobe Premiere in tight synchronization with the sonified sounds. Further scaling and orchestration was then carried out in Ableton Live using the audio to MIDI function. Final editing and music notation was generated in Logic Pro. And then the live performance incorporates Ableton Live and Resolume, a live video performance program. So here's an example of the REON graph as we got it directly from BIRE. This is the barometric pressure for 2 weeks before Hurricane Sandy at West Point. This is the piece of data that opens the work. So first we created a reversed version of it, and then we used Adobe Premiere and Metasynth to animate that graph and sonify it. Of course, that data can be scaled in any way. For this, I used a microtonal scale. So it's a direct translation of the visual into sound. I then used Ableton Live to analyze that microtonal recording and to catch particular notes. And then it created a musical melody, which I notated in conventional notation, and this is what I use in the performance. So here's an example of how the whole thing comes out when it's actually implemented. The video is being triggered by the dynamics of my playing on the Mutantrumpet, the video of the sunrise. I mentioned as the piece goes on, the way we use the data becomes more complex. In that example, it's presented in a very straightforward way. One data graph being translated melodically with nothing else going on. So for the section of North Creek leading into the storm, I used two different sets of data and combined them in different ways. Again, this one I was able to translate into conventional music notation again. And here's how it works when I combine two of these different data sets. And in this case, the next one that comes in, I use in a more repetitive looping way. Again, a kind of metaphor for the human imposition of structure onto nature. So for the storm section, we used all of the data from the different sites all together simultaneously to create a more chaotic, turbulent effect. You may have noticed previously that once we get to the Hurricane Sandy moment, we see drastic changes happening in those environmental graphs. Things dropping to unheard of levels or rising to unheard of levels. And so some of that is reflected in this excerpt, which puts together numerous different patterns with different noise-based sounds as well as pitch sounds. So I used the Mutantrumpet in the performance of Fathom. The Mutantrumpet is an expanded acoustic instrument with unusual timbral and pitch capabilities provided by 3 bells, extra valves, quarter tones. Robert Moog designed and first built the custom analog system for it in 1983, so this is something that I've been working with for 4 decades. It's been a primary vehicle for my work as a composer-performer. At the electronic music studio Stime in 1991, I incorporated digital control so that the instrument was capable of controlling digital audio and video. I continued working at Stime for 20 years, 25 years, and version 4, the current version, was developed in 2015 and was debuted in 2019. I utilize mapping of the Mutantrumpet controllers. Rhythmonics is a system of writing music based on numerical relationships, usually a harmonic series or Fibonacci series, something like that. And one of my big goals as an artist is to set processes in motion out of which surprising and interesting results emerge, a kind of emergent approach. Sampling is also another way that I get at that. And as I've worked more and more with interactive systems, I do incorporate improvisation, and that's very much true of Fathom. There are highly organized elements, but those are combined with improvisation. And I think this is another way of reflecting the processes of nature and life forms in musical structure. Discovery, for me, like it was for John Cage, is often more exciting than invention. There's an image of the Mutantrumpet. You see the different digital controllers, the joysticks up next to the extra set of valves. Pickup in the mouthpiece enables the triggering from my acoustic playing. So to conclude, I'd like to just share a few thoughts about data and music. The graphs are used as scores in some cases directly for the live players in Fathom. And as I mentioned, non-intentionality, Cajun aesthetics, getting away from an egocentric mode of composition. This is one of the reasons why I would choose to work with this kind of a process, and I find it very rewarding. Human-computer interactive systems and chains, neural networks, by combining multiple programs, older and newer technologies together, we tend to create less predictable and more satisfying results, in my experience. Bernard Stiegler, the French writer who was the head of IRCAM for several years, has written about this idea of exosomatic organs, that we're offloading some of the responsibilities of our physical organs to technologies to cope with all of the vast amounts of data and information that we're all confronted with each day. The importance of aesthetics in light of all of this explosion of data and the way the data is revolutionizing the way not only music is created, but how it's consumed. Claire Bishop has written some very interesting work on more in the visual arts, but about the importance of maintaining an aesthetic sensibility in light of this new data-centric world that we're living in. And that's something that I very much have tried to do in Fathom and other pieces in which I utilize these kinds of approaches. The relationship of nature and art. Giorgio Agamben, in his book The Man Without Content, discussed how life was becoming so aestheticized that nature itself was actually taking on the role that art had assumed for several centuries before. An interesting thing to think about in light of Fathom and the notion of building creative works on data sets and systems that model life forms. Accessibility, democratization, the prevalence of artificial intelligence systems for creating music. These are all very powerful forces that are changing our art form radically, and I believe it's very important to keep an eye to the future, but also to stay connected with the human. Thanks for your attention. I hope you'll participate in the concert session and see an excerpt of the entire piece. Thank you.